My name is Vic Iglesias. I'm a cloud solutions architect, and this is...
I'm Ian, and I'm a developer advocate at Google, based in Tokyo, Japan.
So today we're going to kind of walk you through how Google Cloud Platform billing works, as well as show you some cool things you can do once you have the data at your fingertips. Cool. So let's get started. So a lot of what happens in the cloud is you need to do something, you start a new project, you start hammering away using new APIs, creating new data sets, new databases, new instances, and you get something working. So that's great. So now you have something that works, and you often kind of build off of that. At no point did you really think, what kind of instances am I using? What kind of products am I using? How are they built? So someone comes by, the engineering team, and says, hey, so what is the money you're spending for development? Like, well, we don't know. We just kind of spin stuff up. What are you doing to run in prod? Well, you know, the bill kind of looks like this. We think 80-20 dev to prod, but we're not really sure. So at some point, you have to kind of wrangle this back. So today, we're going to go through how billing works, show you how you can estimate for the future, show you how you can look at your past spending, how you can slice and dice your bill so you can separate different pieces of it, and then how you can export your data, which is when things get really interesting. And then we'll show you visualizing your bill using DataStudio. And that's where Ian is going to blow your guys' minds. So let's get started. So what does billing look like in Google Cloud Platform? First, we'll start with some terms. We have projects. And projects are an isolation domain that lets you place resources inside them. So every resource you create in Google Cloud is within the context of a project. Each project has a billing account associated with it. You can have many projects associated with a single billing account, and the billing accounts are associated with some way for us to charge you. So this is kind of a diagram of what it would look like to have 3 projects and 2 billing accounts. At the top, we show the funding sources. So you have a credit card that's associated to a billing account, or a bank account that's associated to your billing account, and those generate invoices. You can also do offline billing, which will invoice you at the end of the month. Here you can see that billing account 1 has 2 projects associated with it, and billing account 2 only has 1 project. So that's kind of the high-level overview of how billing is architected in Google Cloud. Cool. So what if you are really judicious about your cloud usage, and you actually want to know before you start using something how to figure out what it's going to cost you? Well, we have our pricing calculator, so you can enter in all of the different products you intend to use, and this is often a hard thing to do, but you're kind of just getting the shape of what your bill is going to look like, and where you can save some money if you don't or don't use certain products. So you can go ahead and look at that pricing calculator. It's easy to find online. What about going back and looking at last month's bill? So that's pretty easy. In our console, we have a billing overview. Breaks down line items of different products, shows you how much usage you had for those products, and how much you were charged. You can also go back to past transactions and past bills in the console in the transaction view, and has a very similar outline of what you guys have. I get some credits every month to use on Google Cloud, so you can see my bill was negative, which is kind of how you want to keep it if you can. And then at some point, you're going to want to put some guidelines in place to make sure that the right people know that the usage is getting either out of line or staying in line. So we have what are called budgets and alerts. So you can set a budget and say this account or this project should not go over this amount of money in a month. And then you can set up percentages of that budget that you want to be alerted on. So at, for example, 50%, 90%, and 100%. You may not necessarily take corrective action, but you can at least know that it's happening, right? If you get your 90 or your 50% or your 90% alert on the 3rd day of the month, something's probably off. So you can go check it out, figure out what's going on, and then act on it. Now that you've seen all your bills, you can get a line item of each product that was used within a project. What if you have multiple environments that you have running within a project, right? This is very common where you'll have an environment that's dev. You can use our labels, which are key value pairs, in order to label different resources in your project. For example, I have some cloud storage buckets and some compute instances, and I can label a subset of them with the environment dev. I can also go ahead and label my production VMs and storage with the env production. So now when I look at my bill, I can see these labels and be able to partition my spending into different groups. And since these are key value pairs, you can do whatever you need for your organization that makes sense. This is where you get really powerful features out of your cloud platform billing. When you start exporting billing data and can use it do your data science or your machine learning or whatever you need to do in order to get some insights out of your bill. So we allow you to export your billing data straight into BigQuery, and we all know and we've all heard how powerful BigQuery is. So you can export directly into another project. So you can choose a project and a database that you want to export your bill to. And you can also export straight into GCS. So just get a CSV dumped and use your favorite tool, whatever that is. Obviously, our favorite tool is BigQuery. We recommend it, and we'll show how powerful that can be in Ian's demo. So what is the demo going to look like? So we're going to have a billing account that's associated, that has 2 projects in it. And we're going to be sending both of those projects' billing data to a third account's BigQuery database. And from that BigQuery database, we're going to send our data to DataStudio so that we can create some nice dashboards, right? We want to have an executive view of what our bill looks like. Nobody wants to be looking through a transaction view at the executive level. They want to have something that they can kind of glance at and say, we're kind of on track, or be able to dig into a bill really easily. So we're going to set up this dashboard, and Ian's going to take it away and show you how it works.
Awesome. So let's do that. Over to my PC there. We switch over to my PC.
There it is.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so here's my billing account, or this is the Google Cloud Console. And so I have my billing account for this particular set of projects. And so while we're here, we can kind of take a look at some of the different pages that Vic talked about. So here we have the kind of budgets and alerts field. So you can kind of say, create budgets. You can give it a name, over budget, something like this. And then you can specify an amount. And you can specify these in percentages as well also, if I remember right. Yes, down here you can set percentage of a budget or an amount. And you can actually set these to over 100 if you want to as well, in case you're really over budget and you want to get alerts when how far you're over budget as well. Also, you have the transactions page, and right now this particular one doesn't have any transactions. We get a nice nice graphic here. But this is what I really wanted to talk about today, which was the export page. So this is the most powerful part of of billing. So here we have 2 options. We have one to export to BigQuery, and we can show also this file export as well, where we can actually export JSON data every day to Google Cloud Storage. And here we can specify a bucket and a report name for our prefix, and this will just get prefixed to the file names. And then we can export that in CSV or JSON. And that's great, but the files are not as easy to parse, like it'll put a new one in there every day. So what we want to do is export as BigQuery, or export to BigQuery, and we can select the project and the data set, the BigQuery data set, and then just click the Enable BigQuery Export here. So if we do that, it'll just start exporting to BigQuery. And it's really as simple as that. Like inside that data set, it'll create a new table for you. And inside that table, it will start putting in the BigQuery, or in that table, it will start putting the billing transactions. And it essentially does this in, not real time, but close to real time, i.e. like maybe every day or about every day. So you can essentially just query this table and get the latest data about your particular billing account. So let's look at what that table looks like. So over here in BigQuery, we have this table. So it comes as into our data set as a table that says GCP billing export, and then it's got some extra characters after the end. So if we click this, we can kind of see our table. And this is the schema that we get when our table is actually created. So here we can see our billing ID, product. The product is at the level of something like Compute Engine or App Engine or PubSub. And then inside each of those products, we have a resource. So inside of Compute Engine, we have things like instances, we have or VM instances, we have networking or network load balancers, we have persistent disks. Those end up being resources. So you can think of product and then resource as a subtype. And then we have a start time and end time. And essentially inside of this table, we're going to get a new record for every transaction. So for every project and project and resource type, we are going to get a new entry in our table. And that start and end time is going to be at most 1 day. So you know that Google Cloud has per minute billing, so you could have an instance that runs for only a few minutes, and that will get billed. But if you have it open for multiple days, you'll get multiple records for each day. And then inside here, we've got our project, and inside that we get our project metadata like ID, name, and labels for the project itself. And then here's also the labels that we get for all of the objects inside of GCP. So this is the labels that Vic mentioned, where you can label things like BigQuery tables or your instances with your tags to identify things like production and development environments or whatever you see fit. And those get exposed here as part of the billing data as well. So you can then kind of slice and dice your data based on that. And then here we have the kind of usual things like cost and currency and the amount of credits. So these credits, so you'll see things in these credits like sustained use discounts. Like so for VMs, the sustained use discounts will be exported here in the billing as a credit against your billing account. So that's our table. It's pretty straightforward. So if we go ahead here and just kind of take a look at it, we've got a table here. We could say like select our project ID, and then the sum of our costs maybe. Cost. And then go down here and group by the project ID, by project ID. And then we go ahead and run that. This is just a simple query. We can see that we'll get our billing data for our couple of projects. So since I started exporting billing data, this project has had about $7,000 billed against it, and this project has had about $2,000 billed against it. So you can kind of do those type of queries, and you can think of any type of query that you want to. Anything, or you can use the power of BigQuery to actually, or to slice and dice your billing data and kind of get insights that way. So you can do these type of ad hoc queries against the BigQuery table. But that's not actually what's interesting about that. We want to do more powerful things. Your finance officers and your finance folks are not going to be writing SQL probably every day to figure out the costs for your resources. So what they're going to do is have something that's much more visual, something more like a dashboard. And so that's what I want to show you guys today. So this is actually the Google DataStudio, which is a really easy way to create these kind of dashboards, right? And kind of show them to your finance officers and to your finance folks, and they can kind of play with them and get an idea of what the costs look like. So let's take a look at one of those. And it looks like I didn't actually create one.
Uh-oh. Ian's going to have to figure this out on the fly.
Yeah, so I guess we're going to have to do it live.
Let's see if you can do it live. I have faith. What do you guys think? Ian can get you guys a dashboard? Live?
So we're going to do this live. And this is good because we can kind of get a sense of how easy it is to do these kind of dashboards. So also we can kind of think of, just to get us in the mindset here, let's imagine we have you're at a startup or something, and we've got our finance officer breathing down our neck. He wants our report in 20 minutes or something like this. So we need to quickly put together our report. So the first thing that you do when you create a new report inside of DataStudio is you get a blank page like this, and then you're prompted to add a new data source. So here we can click a new data source, and then in here there's a bunch of different data sources, but the one we care about is BigQuery. So we'll click that, and then click our project name and our data set, and then we'll get our BigQuery export table here. And once we've selected that, we can click connect, and that will add it to our report. And what's really cool is that because BigQuery is a table and it knows the schema, that schema comes into our report. So here we've identified all the fields that are available in that data source, and these correspond to the fields in the table, right? And then each of those has a type, and then we can use those to actually create our reports. So we don't actually have to write any SQL, and we'll see how to create those reports in a second. But here we get a little prompt. We'll add that to our report. And you can kind of view the data sources by clicking on this resources section and do manage data sources, and you can kind of see all of the ones that are added to the report. So we're only going to add one actually for this one, but now that we have a data source, let's go ahead and create a little bit of Chrome just to make this look nice. And add a header, some nice GCP blue, and then we're going to add an image actually. Go here, put in an image, our file, go to the desktop, because I have these Google Cloud logos just hanging around on my desktop.
You got to make it look flashy.
Yeah, you got to make this flashy. We want to wow our finance officer. So we did that, and then we'll add a little title just to add our text. And we'll make this really big, 48, and put this in white. Awesome dashboard. Right? This is pretty easy so far. We just created a little bit of Chrome just to make it look nice, but this is where it gets interesting. We can start adding these kind of graphs to our report. So first, let's just add a pie chart and see what that looks like. Whoops. Go like this. So once I add a pie chart, kind of DataStudio will figure out the fields from our data source, and it will kind of by default put in some values. So right away you get some pretty interesting reports, and in this case it's a little bit small to see, but you can actually see that this pie chart is showing us our costs by product here. So here we see Compute Engine and App Engine. So this particular billing account, we have mostly Compute Engine. About 78% of our costs are at Compute Engine, and 20% of our costs are App Engine. But I don't want to do it quite at that level. I wanted to do it at a little bit more granular level. So what I'm going to do is change the size a little bit here, and then I'm going to change the fields here, the dimension that I'm going to be using for this particular report. So instead, I'm going to choose the resource type. Now, if we choose the resource type, we get a much more granular pie chart. And this guy is going to tell us that we are, let's put this over here. We can see, based on the resources, so we can see this is our GCP instances, or GCE instances. This is our persistent disks. So persistent disks are about 16% of our costs, and then front-end instances are 11, and data stores 9, and so on. We'll go out here back to the edit mode, move that over. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add a date filter. And what these do is allow you to have a date dropdown essentially in the report. So this makes the reports really interactive. And what you can do is, when you're viewing the report, you can actually select a date range, and that will apply to all the graphs within the report. So you can then not just create a report for like this month, you can create a report and then have it interact and be interactive, and you can select the date ranges that you want to have for that report. So here we'll select a default date range, and this data set just happens to be from December to February. That's that. And then we'll add another filter here. And this is a filter control that is shown as a table list. So this is actually a little bit small to see, but what this does is allow you to filter by a particular dimension as well. So here we've got it created by default the product, so we can kind of uncheck these and filter by products. But what I want to do is change the dimension here to be the project ID. So this particular billing account has 2 projects on it, and we can kind of see that in our filter. And so if we go back here and look at it, we can kind of see that we've got 2 projects here. And then one more, we're going to add a time series, and this time we're going to make a time series based on our costs. So here's our daily costs, essentially, over time. And then, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a breakdown dimension. And this breakdown dimension will actually break all the costs down over the particular dimension. So here I want to break costs down by product. So I'm going to select the product field. When I do that, that's going to break it down by product, so you'll see a line graph on this per product. We can see that we're overwhelmingly using 2 products. One of them is GCE, so the compute engine, and one is App Engine. And you can see the compute engine costs don't really change over time because we have the same amount of VMs running, but App Engine kind of changes as the load comes in. You can see that over time, and that's really helpful. So just in a few minutes, you can kind of get a really neat graph that's interactive and shows you a lot of information. Let's actually make this a little bit smaller so we can see the whole thing. And then it's actually interactive here, so what we can do is we can say, view the data over the last 30 days, or just for the last week. And you can do that by just changing the date fields here, and all of the SQL queries are generated for you and then applied to the graphs. And we can also do that here for these filters here. So if we uncheck one of these, it will remove that particular one from our project. So here, or from our dashboard. So here we've unchecked the My Web App project and just left the GAE app. And so we can see that this particular project is using App Engine, and the costs are basically just front-end instances and data store read-ops. And if we go back the other way, we can see the other project is a GCE-based project, and so we can see that is using things like GCE instances, persistent disk, as well as load balancers. And here we can see that we've got network load balancing, we've got other custom instance types, and then we've got another set of load balancers. So the load balancers are actually a fair bit of our cost. So maybe we could think about ways to reduce that cost later. So this is a really neat dashboard, and you'll notice that I didn't write any SQL queries against BigQuery. It just knew the fields, and it knew how to use the fields based on their types to generate the queries for me and generate the graphs. I didn't have to do any of that. And that's great if we want to do something that's relatively simple, but it's still powerful. But if we want to get really into our data, we can actually do things like custom queries. So here I'll hit the edit mode again, and DataStudio allows you to create multiple pages for your reports. So here I'm going to add a new page, and in this new page, I'm going to add a few new graphs. But these graphs are going to be slightly different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bar graph, but I'm going to populate this bar graph with data from a custom query that I write. And so we'll see what that looks like here. So when I go here, I can say, choose the data source for this particular graph. And what I'm going to do is actually just create a new data source. And when I do that, I can click BigQuery. And instead of clicking on My Projects, I can go down here to Custom Query. And then from there, you choose a project for the custom query to run in. And then you can just type your query in here. And I've got a query that I've got written already.
Pretty simple query, as you can see.
Yeah, this is,
not too
run-of-the-mill.
Anybody can figure that stuff out.
It's
not
a
a
pretty
big deal.
nice one. Well, if we have some time, we can actually go through this, but
Well, the interesting thing is what Ian's going to do here is basically try to predict the future with BigQuery.
Exactly.
So you can tell your CFO what you think you're going to spend later without even having to use the pricing calculator.
yeah.
Let's see what kind of magic you can come up with here.
Yeah, so what this is actually doing is it's, over the last 3 months of data, it's actually doing a linear regression over the last 3 months of data, and then we're going to solve that linear regression for the next couple months, and what that's going to do is predict the current month and the next month's billing data. So we'll see what that looks like here.
How many lines of code was that, or in the query?
In this query, this one is 83 lines of code.
That's not bad. That's not bad.
So when we get out, what we get out of this is we get these 3 fields from the SQL query, and those fields get translated into the fields that come into my report, right? So DataStudio knows from the custom query what the output fields are, and then we can use those output fields to generate our report. So here we have a future balance and a balance field, and I've kind of separated those two, but basically the past months will have data in the balance field, and the future months will have the data in the future months field. And I'll kind of show you why I did that, but it kind of has to do with the report itself. And then I'm just going to add that to my report as a data source. And then in here, in the dimension, I can select from the data that came back from my custom query. So here I'm going to select month as my dimension, and as my metric, I'm going to select balance here. And so you can see that I've created a bar graph for the past 3 months of billing data. So these are my costs for the last 3 months. And so I'll go back, and what you can do is you can actually add multiple metrics to a lot of these graphs. So what I'm going to do here is add another metric, and this time I'm going to add the future balance. So normally what you would do in these cases is multiple metrics would show up as bar graphs that sit next to each other. But because these are kind of mutually exclusive for each month, they kind of show up with big spaces in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of a hack with this. Is I'm going to change it to multiple colors. And then I'm going to actually stack these. And since they don't stack, they stack on basically nothing, they kind of look like they're next to each other. So this is a little bit of a display hack, but you can see that I did that so that I can put the past months in blue and the future months in red here. And so this is actually the current month and the next month, so I don't actually have billing data for this, but I'm actually extrapolating from my past data what my future data might look like. So you can see that my past data is trending down, so we've extrapolated out that the billing data will go down a little bit over the next couple months. That's great. We can kind of predict the future a little bit and kind of see, maybe ease our financial officers' minds a little bit about how much we're spending. But the last graph that I want to do here is what really illustrates the power of using BigQuery, exporting your billing data to BigQuery. Because BigQuery can be, you can put any type of data into a BigQuery table, and likely you already have a lot of business data there. What we can do is actually combine our billing data with data that we know about our application in order to create much better and more richer metrics. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another data source using a custom query. And I'm going to use a slightly less complicated query.
It's only 82 lines of code.
No, it's actually only 17 lines of code in this one. But this one's actually a really simple query, and I'll go ahead and connect that in. But what I'm going to do is, since my application is a, that's interesting, kind of came with the wrong fields there. I didn't quite copy and paste it properly. There we go. So what I'm doing here is my application is a web application, right? So I'm using Google Analytics, and I have Google Analytics Premium. So I'm actually exporting that data, the analytics data, to BigQuery. So in this case, I'm just using my analytics data. I'm going to go ahead and apply this to join that analytics table with my BigQuery table, and then generate essentially a cost per unique user. And so what I'm doing here is I get out a couple of fields, the date and the cost per unique user. So I'll add that to the report. And I'll show you the graph first, but then we can kind of look at what the query is doing, and I'll explain a little bit about what the query is doing. Whoops.
One thing to note is, despite all of our data sources here coming from BigQuery, there are a bunch of other sources you can use, like just a regular sheet. If you've got a sheet with a bunch of data that you need to merge in with some BigQuery, you can do that as well. Not everything has to be coming from BigQuery.
Yeah, right. So for a single report, you can only choose one single data source. For inside a report, you can have multiple graphs, and each one can come from different data sources. But for a single graph, you need to have you can only associate one data source. So generally, if you want to combine multiple data sources into a single graph, then the best way to do that is with multiple BigQuery tables and then joining them with a custom query. And that's exactly what I did here. So we'll take a look at what this particular query is doing. But what we're doing here is we're taking our billing data, and this is my billing table, and then we're doing a join on that to our Google Analytics sessions table. And when we do that, we can extract out the distinct visitor IDs. So this essentially gives us a unique user every day. Yeah, and we're grouping that by date. And then we join that with the tables. And then up at the top here, we're dividing the cost by the number of unique users to get the number of the cost per unique user. So we can kind of see how that goes over time. And we can see that we have some spiky days where our cost per unique user goes up really high. So we can kind of investigate why that might be, and maybe find out why our application is becoming inefficient on those days. We can also combine things with not just Google Analytics data, but say data that happens to be coming from your application. Maybe you have log data that's already created that you can join it to, or maybe you have some other type of data about how many users you have, or the lifetime revenue that you get from those users, and you can kind of compare that to how much you're spending for your resources in the cloud. So this is very, very powerful to actually get a much more holistic view about how you're spending your resources. Not just I'm spending my X number of dollars here, X number of dollars here, but actually per user how much you're costing, so that in the future, say if you have an application that has 5,000 users right now, but what happens if you have 10,000 users or 100,000 users? In those cases, you can extrapolate how much your application would cost as your application scales into the future. And this is also really good because, say, if you are using multiple clouds, who happens to be using multiple clouds? GCP plus Amazon. So a lot of you, right? So one of those things that you could do with this is say, you get your billing data, you export it to your GCP billing data, you export that to BigQuery. You get your CSV dump from Amazon, you put that into BigQuery because BigQuery is awesome, and then you join those you put those two together, and you can kind of look at your cost per user, say for each cloud. So say GCP, versus another cloud. What's the cost per user for each of those clouds, right? And you can see as your application scales up and gets more users, where you're actually sinking those costs and where you're actually the cost is more efficient. So I know that you guys don't want to, pay us more money, but the way to kind of be happy, or for everyone to be happy, maybe, is for everyone to kind of realize which clouds have the best cost per user, and kind of move those workloads to hopefully to GCP.
Yeah, so what we've shown you today is basically how to look at your bill and pay us less money, which is totally great for us. We want that to happen. I think all this power and these specific queries are not important as much as the conceptual pieces that we've shown you. The fact that you can bring different data sources in, the fact that you can chop up your bill in different ways, and especially that you can use DataStudio to make really easy dashboards that you can present a holistic view of your bill. And depending on what questions you're being asked, you can answer those really easily with DataStudio. So that's about it for our presentation.